Jason, so as we recently discussed, you made your own browser.
Yes. And you might ask the question, why? Why would anybody want their own when there's perfectly good ones around?
Right.
Part of what inspired it was an article I had read about Firefox specifically.
Okay.
And Firefox, and those of you who are on the inside could probably correct me, but Firefox had originally written down on paper that they were never going to charge money or sell. They were never going to sell people's information. Mm-hmm. And they had to change that because I guess they were entering into a business model where I don't know if it was a VPN that they wanted to implement within the browser, but essentially monetizing of user information was something that they might have had to do.
Okay.
That's the facts as I think I know them. And so it inspired me to say, well, I'm going to make my own browser then. Because way back in the 1990s, I had done that anyway. And it was really easy to do back in the pure Microsoft Stack days. For those of you who remember Visual Studio back in that time frame and COM objects, you could instantiate Internet Explorer, a very cut down version of Internet Explorer. And therefore, you didn't have to write your own rendering engine and all that stuff. And so being able to instantiate a COM object and then code your own visual elements onto this browser that was created for you and then use it just like a browser. And literally within 10 minutes, you had your own custom browser. And it was great.
Right.
And that kind of inspired me through some code vibing, which we talked about on a previous episode, to then build something that I, just as a joke, because it was a term I had thrown out on this podcast a long time ago, the get off my lawn browser. And not the least of which is because I wanted a browser where people weren't selling my user information, and my cookie handling was done in a very custom, terse way. And as an SSL nerd, as you know, Tim, finding a browser right now that easily gives you all SSL information regarding the SSL certificate regarding the website that you've browsed to, that's getting a little harder and harder. In other words, most of the visual elements about SSL have kind of disappeared. In order to get information, you do have to kind of dig in certain browsers. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't give me all the information I want.
Right.
So whether it's everything from the big three, right, Safari, Chrome, Firefox, but then there's also, Brave and all the Opera, the privacy type browsers. I was never satisfied. So I said, I want crypto nerd browser. And so that was the point of doing it.
Right.
And I succeeded, Tim. I succeeded. And so people might then ask, well, what's the point? And the point is, I wanted to see how I felt bringing back the green address bar.
Okay.
I just wanted to see how that felt. Mm-hmm. And what I realized that the way that I was displaying the information, so in other words, when I go to sectigo.com,
right,
I will see, yes, it is a Sectigo as the issuer organization name. I get to see which route that Sectigo issued that certificate from. I get to see whether or not it's a ECC 256 or RSA 2048. Yeah. I put all the information.
Yeah.
And I found that once that information was always on the screen in a nice little piece below the address bar, I then evaluated whether or not it was EV, OV, or DV. And I did that really simply. Mm-hmm. EV is basically, there's an OID you can look for.
Yep.
So EV is the simplest one to look for.
Yep.
OV is simple because if there's an organization name,
it's OV.
It's OV. And if there isn't, it's DV.
Yep.
So trust me, coding that with code vibing took zero amount of time, right? Mm-hmm. AI figured out how to do that from an English prompt.
Okay.
Isn't that cool?
That's cool.
I didn't even have to feed it the OID. It figured it out.
Okay.
Right. Think about it. That's great.
Yeah.
And so then what I had shown you a screenshot. I said, hey, here's the Get Off My Lawn browser. I think it was like version 4 of the browser. And it actually had the green address bar on an EV site. And I said, hey, nostalgia time. I'm showing you a browser with that. And then I thought to myself, I was already showing OV, EV, or DV in that little information visual element. And what I ended up asking AI to do was, hey, whenever I'm on EV, don't make the address bar green. Just make the letters EV bold and green.
Right.
And that was enough.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, there's lots of, like, the UX could be designed in all kinds of ways. And, you know, that original design, I think, was made with the idea that that a fresh audience would be seeing it and that no training would be provided. And it was attempting to communicate something that people would just, you know, a conclusion that they would come to just based on the visual cues. I think in your case, it's very straightforward to say, you know, I'm going to have a set of indicator lights, for instance, because you know to look for those indicator lights and you know what they mean.
Exactly right.
Right.
Exactly right. So some of the other things that were important to me were very advanced cookie handling, because I wanted it to not just be a browser that was like in a pure incognito mode, not accepting any, like I could have made it so terse with cookies as to not accept anything. And I do have that mode. Like absolutely don't even, just ignore all cookie attempts. Just ignore absolutely everything. But I didn't do that.
Right.
Because I wanted some state handling through cookies, legitimate state handling. And I also wanted to be able to use my browser to, like, believe it or not, go to my bank and pay a bill.
Right.
And then end the session.
Right.
And be done.
Yep.
And what I found, and this is part of the experience, Tim, that I want to talk about in this podcast, is I found it very interesting that having a custom browser where I could do something such as, all right, I'm in general browsing mode, cookies go away. Oh, I'm now going to change modes into a non-incognito, if you will, but do it in a way that's a little different than the browsers handle it currently, and actually watch the cookies as they're happening during a legitimate session. Just to me felt satisfying. And it's probably because I'm a technical person. I can see how browser designers would be like, Jay, we would never do that for anybody else in the world. But I just find that a browser that's tuned to the way you want to browse. And I realize that there's things such as browser plugins that can help you with things like this. But when you can code vibe your own browser to have it, and it's not a plugin, it's the way the browser works, I was surprisingly delighted with just how I had my browsing experience. Yeah. I think one of the final points I'm going to make, because I don't want to over-rotate on this little custom browser that's just for me, was rendering SSL information using Chromium was hard because Chromium is protecting itself from manipulation. In other words, they really have done a good job for, if there's malicious code on your computer, if your endpoint has been compromised, boy, that sandbox of Chromium actually is like that. It's going to make the hacker's life a little bit more difficult, or a lot more difficult, because my custom browser, which was wrapping Chromium was complaining. And that was a very interesting learning thing. And I think unless you're a professional coder, you just wouldn't know that.
Sure. How would you?
How would you know? But you might read about a sandbox in Chromium and go, I don't know what that's doing for me. Oh, it's doing a lot for you. That's great. But I found that my experience, because I was using a MacBook and Mac OS, WebKit 2 was just so delightful and fast. But on the other hand, the next bit of learning is a whole other podcast when I tried to start to interrupt the native Apple root store. And that's where Apple was like, nope.
Okay.
And that's going to be a whole other podcast, Tim.
That's interesting. So, and then lastly, of course, the best part of making your own browser, you get to name it.
And so I think we've said it at least more than once within the 500 episodes.
We've joked about it.
We joked about the name, the Get Off My Lawn. Like two old fogies. If we made a browser, we would call it the Get Off My Lawn browser.
Yes.
So that's its name.
The Get Off My Lawn browser. I absolutely love it. Well, I got to say, Jason, having made your own browser, I have never been more proud to call you my friend.
Right on, Tim.
This has been Root Causes.